I assume everybody has a copy of that, of the example charter, the Fort Stockton charter. So what I thought is we just start at the beginning and just work our way through it. I'll let you know what I think is boilerplate, for legalese, boilerplate language that you're going to see anywhere. Still feel free to tweak it if you choose. And then I'll also point out, okay, this is where we really need to, y'all really need to have a discussion about something. And so if everybody's okay with that, we'll just start at the top with the preamble. And the preamble is pretty straightforward. I mean, we would change the name, of course, to protect the innocent. This is probably recorded, so I'm not gonna, I love Fort Stockton. I was like, anyway, never mind. I say things and I get in trouble from other clients. So the preamble is pretty straightforward, and I think what we do, Madam Chair, is I'd like to get a vote on each section, and so that way, you know, it's on the record that we've approved it. And so I would say the preamble, other than changing the name Fort Stockton to the City of Garden Ridge, is pretty straightforward, pretty quote-unquote boilerplate. It's not anything of any substance, but if y'all would like to tweak it and change it to some other preamble, that would be fine as well. And so with that said, I defer to Madam Chairman.
Does anyone on the commission have any questions, concerns, comments, or changes? Here.
The only addition is to change Pecos to Comal County.
Of course, yes.
Anything else?
Well as the name, Fort Stockton,
Right, yeah. Of course, any,
things like that.
yes, sir. Any, like any name changes, all that would be accomplished.
Anything else? If not, there being no concerns or questions, can I assume from your silence that you approve? We're ready to move on to item number 2.
So Article 1 is your form of government. So Section 1.01, this is where you may or may not want to have some conversation. This particular section lays out a form of government known as the City Council Manager form of government. It essentially states that the powers of the city are vested in the elected council, who enacts legislation, they adopt the budgets, determine policy, appoint officials, they do everything that they do now. And that the powers shall be utilized as in the manner as prescribed by the charter, and if not prescribed, then as prescribed by ordinance, state constitution, or the state statutes. There are, so this is a point where, I don't know who's going to discuss what, but this is where we might talk about how we currently operate our current form of government. Technically, our current form of government is a council mayor form of government, but I'll defer the how the city actually operates now over to the mayor and the city administrator. You actually have a city administrator professional handle the day-to-day operations.
So mayor, city administrator, which one of y'all would like to come up and describe or sit and tell us what we currently have in place now, little nuances, anything you would like to share with regards to this, as well as the other 2 forms of government that Charlie mentioned to us the other day, because this is one of the big decision points in this whole process, is which type of government. So it's important for y'all to understand what we have now.
Yeah, this is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, right? Quick question, Charlie, do we need just a consensus on each section, or do we need a motion and approved vote?
It was something like consensus on the previous one is absolutely fine. On something like this, I would prefer to have a formal motion and formal vote.
Okay, so there's 3 choices of government, right, that we discussed the other night for home rule. There's the mayor, council, right? The council manager, and then commission. So the way we operate things right now, as Charlie said, is technically mayor, council, and in the city of Garden Ridge, as far as how it's classified, but truly how we do our operations in the city for home rule, bless you, is the council manager type form of government. And that's how we run things on a daily basis. Technically, right now, as General Law A, Charlie, correct me if I'm wrong, the mayor, with the way we do things, is the chief executive officer of the city. The way we operate that is I delegate that authority to Nancy as the city administrator and her department heads to run the day-to-day operations of the city, day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month. Now, that being said, Nancy and I and the department heads, but specifically Nancy and I, are tied at the hip on how the city runs and keeps me informed of what I need to know, and which is most things. Some things are pretty straightforward administratively, but what we would like to do in this situation, how are we going forward? Here are the employees that, with vacancies that we need to hire, here's when we're doing interviews, do you want to be part of that? Here are administrative functions, here's disciplinary issues from our human resources area. Here's great things going on, all of those things. So Nancy runs the city of Garden Ridge, and how we would do that with the city council manager form of government is exactly what we do to this day. So Jim, to your point the other night of if it ain't broke, don't fix it, it's how we do business right now. And to go a little bit further, my number one job when I took the oath of office 18 months ago is to protect the city of Garden Ridge. And that's what I do. The ability to go to home rule and continue with a city council manager form of government that's dictated by law in our Constitution as we go through this helps to protect the city of Garden Ridge. So it helps to ensure that the city council and the mayor find the right city manager, who we currently have, right? And the right department heads. And then we would dictate that, hey, once the council hires and approves that city manager, then the city manager becomes the chief executive officer of the city. Now, we would want to keep the mayor and the council via the mayor informed of how the city's operating, some of the big ticket items, some of the things that, there's a lot of administrative things that we don't need to bother the council with unless they ask. But we, Nancy and I would still, the manager and the mayor would still talk about how things run on a daily basis. So, and we do that, we check in with each other daily. So nothing would really change with going to a city council manager type of home rule government. And that is what we prefer, having those discussions over the last couple months, and specifically today, or the last couple days, myself and Nancy, myself, Marissa, all of us together with Lisa Swint, the Mayor Pro Tem, Council Member Place 2, as well as your Chairman Nadine. We met today and went through a lot of these things to discuss what the official city position is. And I think I've stated that. So we would like to be city council manager form of government for home rule and keep things very much the way they are, but codify it into law. Questions for me?
Thank you, Mayor. Any questions from the commission? Yes, sir.
I'm Jim, and as I've studied this Terrell Blodgett document and tried to get myself educated, Mayor, what I'm struggling with under the council manager form of government is really what the role of the mayor is. We elect a mayor to lead and run our city. But when I read about the council manager type of government, really all the leverage is in the city manager. And I'm trying to understand your role as a mayor versus, and I don't mean this derogatory, a puppet head that's just the mayor of a city, but really the city manager is making all the decisions. And I understand that 87% of the home rule cities in Texas are council, manager, forms of government. And that's where I'm trying to understand the mayor-council relationship and why that is not a good solution.
Well, first of all, if you're going to have a mayor, we have a part-time mayor, right? And volunteer mayor, and all the council members are part-time and volunteers. So in order to, like, the city of Houston has the home rule with the mayor-council, and that's a full-time position, and that position is the chief executive officer of the town of Houston.
$1,000 a year.
Well,
The mayor does.
In Terrell's, in the document, it's $15,000 a month and some change, right? So, whereas the city of San Antonio has a council manager form of government, and currently Ron Nuremberg makes $622 a month, well, that's from 2010, he makes more than that now. So, and the council members are paid as well, they get like $62,000 a year. That's the city of San Antonio. Here we are at 5,000 people, the city of Garden Ridge, with a part-time mayor as a volunteer, and a part-time council as a volunteer. So, like I said before, I am the office of the mayor is the chief executive officer of the city. But I delegate that in my capacity now, the way I like to run things is to delegate that authority directly to Nancy to run the city on a daily basis and keep me well informed of what's going on and where do I need to become involved other than just, hey, this is happening, and then what are your thoughts on this? How do you want to proceed? So that is how we do business right now. And it goes into law, and suddenly what you're kind of getting at, I think, Jim, is that the mayor's just a government ceremonial head. It actually says that later on in this document. In times of military law declared by the governor, then I become the chief executive officer, which we already state in our crisis communications plan that we drafted over the past year and went final with over the summer. Basically says the same thing. But as we read through the different functions in this document of what the mayor does and what the council does, the mayor, through the council, does have some pretty big responsibilities. And if things start to go awry with the way the city is run, then the council, via the mayor, have direct responsibility and some actions that we can take to correct what the city manager is doing. So we leave the day-to-day operations of the city to the professionals, like Charlie said on Monday, hey, leave that to the professionals. But then there's a governing body, like a board of directors, if you will, comprised of the mayor and the council to provide oversight of that. So it's not just a ceremonial head, it is running how the city functions and how citizens give us input and providing oversight of how the city actually operates.
And can I follow up with that, Mayor, just briefly?
Yeah, please.
Because Mr. Church said something very important that I think is a misconception with a council manager form of government. He said that the city manager makes all the decisions. That's not true. The city council makes all the decisions. The city council, in a city council manager form of government, goes through the process and hires a professional who has the experience in operating and running a city on a day-to-day basis. But the manager's obligations, and maybe we go look at the city manager's obligations as we're going through this. And I think they're listed in here for some of theirs. The city council makes all the decisions. They set the budget, they adopt the ordinances, they adopt all the policies, they do all of those things, like the board of directors. That was a great example. They set all the policy, and the city manager's role in a city manager form of government is to then implement those decisions that are made by city council. And if the city manager fails to properly implement their decisions, and that's where the city manager has the flexibility, which is how to implement those decisions, right? There's some flexibility in how those decisions are implemented, but they have to be done consistent with the direction given by the city council. And so the city manager doesn't really make all the decisions. The city council makes those decisions through adoption of policies, adoption of the budget, adoption of ordinances, adoption of resolutions, all the things that give the direction to not only the city manager, but the staff, all the other city staff. And if the manager doesn't implement those policies in the way that the council feels appropriate, they may then fire the city administrator. In a council manager form of government for a general law city, the mayor is the chief executive officer, but the statute that creates the form of government doesn't actually give the mayor any power other than the power over the drafting of the budget. As a general law city, the mayor's only authority in a general law city under the statute is the mayor is the budget officer and is responsible for preparing the budget, all right? Any other authority given to the mayor is given to the mayor through the governing body. So in this instance, the authority and power to run the day-to-day, not power, I don't like that word, the authority or responsibility to run the day-to-day operations have not been delegated to the mayor. I have represented general law type A cities where the day-to-day operations has been delegated to the mayor. Those cities are about 500 to 1,500 in population. Once you get much bigger than that, it becomes necessary to have someone who is not, who is more full-time and has more understanding of the day-to-day operations of government. And so they usually hire a city administrator and then they transfer the authority to handle the day-to-day operations to a city administrator. And so that's what you've done here, is even though there's a council mayor form of government, through the city council, through the adoption of an ordinance, has transferred that responsibility and authority to a city administrator. Under your current form of government, under your current structure, city council could at any time change that. They could say, no, we're going to turn all that authority back over to the mayor, and the mayor is going to be responsible for running the day-to-day operations. And the mayor would then would not be making any of the decisions because the mayor doesn't vote, except in the case of a tie in this form of government, type A general law. So the mayor would then implement those day-to-day responsibilities. I can tell you one of the cons to having a council mayor form of government in a charter is that if the mayor doesn't do what the council wants to do through the adopted policies, the council has no remedy. They can't fire the mayor. And I've dealt with that before in a city that is a smaller city that adopted a council mayor form of government. They had a mayor come in that refused to implement any other policies. That mayor did whatever that mayor wanted to do. They couldn't get rid of it, so they did a charter amendment, and guess what they changed their form of government to? Just last year, they changed it to a council manager form of government. Now, obviously in Houston, it works out just fine, so there's pros and cons. But I just wanted to make sure everybody understands that there is a perception that the city manager makes all the decisions. City manager doesn't make any decisions. They make day-to-day decisions on hiring and firing and those types of things. But it's all under the umbrella of the adopted policies and procedures and ordinances and budgets that the legislative body adopts. And if they don't do what they're supposed to do under a council manager form of government, they fire them. So just as a follow-up to what you said.
Thanks, Charlie.
Well, without belaboring the discussion, you said that you have, as a mayor, important decisions and roles. I'm not understanding what those are. I mean, I understand the council manager format, there's a lot of the decisions the city manager makes, but I'm trying to understand the role of the mayor in a city manager form of government. Because you said you have important decisions to make, but I don't know what they are.
So, how best to answer your question? So our city administrator runs the day-to-day operations of the city. The mayor, runs the council. Keeps within the limits of the Texas Open Meetings Act, keeps them informed of what's going on in the city and what's upcoming on the agenda for like next week's council meeting. And then how we present that to the council, that information, when they get that information, and how, and we're gonna get into this later with, does the mayor vote or not vote? How the mayor presents that information, whether it's an ordinance, a resolution, a approval of something from planning and zoning, something from a different commission, how that works. So, and if I don't do my job with that, then that hurts the city of Garden Ridge, because then the council's not, as a part-time volunteer council, they're not fully informed of the situations that they're gonna be presented to them at the council meeting. So, and then we vote on an ordinance, a resolution, a request for variance as a boarding zone of adjusters, right, for planning and zoning. A bunch of different things to talk to you, to explain to you what I do as the mayor. So as the part-time mayor, I stay as much out of Nancy's way as I can, her and the department heads in the city to run the day-to-day operations, week to week, month to month, keeping me informed on the things that I need to know as the chief executive officer and the mayor to take that to council and how I present those things to council. So I think our relationship in this commission is that you ask questions, then I fail to answer your question well enough, but I'm getting head nods from the rest of the commission going, no, Rob, I get that. So I'm not gonna ask you if I answer your question. So, but have I given you an explanation that informs you of what I do as the mayor, which really wouldn't change anything going to a council manager?
I would also say that as a mayor, you have the power of persuasion. You go and meet with other mayors. Nancy doesn't go to those meetings, right? So you have that power of persuasion that you come and inform the council. So I think that the mayor has a job that we don't even see all the things that you do. And the meetings, the conferences, the meet and greets that you do. So you have a huge factor in persuasion in helping the council understand, because like you said, they're part-time, these are not paid salaries, they're not in the business every day. And that Nancy keeps you informed, but you also keep the council informed. So I see a real integral part as a mayor. And as we get to the part where you have a term and a vote, that will matter too. And so, and I think the power of persuasion isn't a negative.
No.
It's an informed decision.
Yes, and we'll, like you said, we'll get into that later on, Diana. But Jim, when you were flying and you were the aircraft commander, what was your job description?
I was in charge of that area.
But keep going with that. I mean, yeah, just in charge. So you were kind of the guy that, the chief executive officer, or you put the gear down, or what did you
Yeah.
do?
I was given an authority to command and control that airplane.
That's
And
what
all
I do as the
decisions
mayor.
fell on me.
So I'm the aircraft commander, and that's what I do as the mayor. And I delegate putting the gear down and some other things to the city administrator to keep the plane flying. But when it comes down to it, I make those decisions. I can delegate a lot of those decisions to Nancy, and I do. And through home rule, council manager, I can do those things too. And if I don't like what is happening in the city for the operations, then I can take that after I discuss that with the city manager as the mayor. I can take that to the council and we can act upon that as the board of directors, as the overall aircraft commander. So,
And don't mistake what I'm doing. I've tried to study this as hard, and I'm new, and I understand the mayor council is not the preferred method, but I'm just trying to understand those unintended consequences, because I'm hearing a lot of authority in a city manager, but we don't elect the city manager, we elect a mayor. And that's why I'm just trying to understand in this format.
and you're doing great for your second time up here.
No, I'm just trying to understand the difference between a mayor-council and a council-manager form of government, because that's what we're discussing in this paragraph, which I think is fundamentally important for the city of Garden Ridge.
Yes. Maybe one of the things we can do when we get to the mayor, I wasn't a big fan of ceremonial. What is it?
Yeah, it says,
Is that by law? We have
no,
to-
well, no, it's just common language that
I wasn't a big fan of ceremonial, like.
yeah, that folks,
by
that folks, that folks put in there. But I can tell you this, where's the, yeah. There it is. Oh, okay, for all, shall be recognized as head of city government for all ceremonial purposes, and by the governor for purposes of military law. So, we really can't put, we're not there yet, but we really can't put for all purposes, because you're not the head of the government for all purposes, as, not you specifically, but the mayor position generally. But we can work on that language when we get to it. But I would say this, because this is these are really good questions and things that need to be thought about. A council mayor form of government and a council mayor form of, they're not black and white in how they operate. Now, there are ways that they operate in the state in the majority of time, at the majority of time, right? And it's nuanced. So, for example, the city of Pflugerville, a little larger than Garden Ridge, but they have a council manager form of government. But the mayor is responsible, the city manager is responsible, with the assistance, it actually says it in their charter, with the assistance of the mayor to set the agenda. And so they wanted to make sure that the mayor had some say and some input with respect to the setting of the agenda. And so they put that in their charter to make sure that occurred. In the city of Houston, obviously much bigger city, as a matter of fact, one district in Houston is over 100,000 in population, right? So one council member represents, what is the math on that? 20 times the amount of the population of the entire city of Garden Ridge. But in that city, the mayor is actually running the day. That mayor runs the day-to-day operations. That mayor is in charge of doing everything that a city manager would do. And in any other form of government, the mayor doesn't have that responsibility. The mayor is, and I hate to say it, is a member of the governing body and has no other authority unless that authority is granted to them in the charter. And the authority that is usually granted is the right to vote. Now, when we get to that section, we can have a broader discussion, but if you go talk to former Mayor Carpenter in the city of Schertz and ask him, Schertz has a council manager form of government, 7 council members, the mayor doesn't vote. If you go talk to Mayor Carpenter's like, I don't want to be the city manager and I don't want the right to vote. Mayor Carpenter felt his power and authority was exactly what you said. The power of persuasion, the power to consensus build, the power to bring people together, both staff and the council, for purposes of making decisions in the best interest of the community. That's where Mayor Carpenter felt his role as the mayor was, because he did not have any day-to-day operations within the city. So the role of the mayor is what the mayor makes of it, honestly, in a council manager form of government. I have some cities I represent where the mayor in a council manager form of government just shows up at the council, runs the meeting, cuts the ribbons, and that's it. I have others where they're going to every TML event, they're part of there's a mayor's group, they go to the ACOG, they're part of the ACOG, they go to the ACOG meetings. They will, with the right city manager, and I already can see that this is the case here, the right city manager involves the mayor in all of these things. The mayor is the main point of contact for purposes of handling the day-to-day operations and communicating with the council. And there's nothing that says that. That's just what happens. That's just how I don't know why or how. I hate to say it's magic, but that's how it plays out. Because if it doesn't play out that way, the city manager gets fired. Because the council has that power and control. And I do want to stress, because I do hear this a lot when I go to places and I speak and I talk about charters and other things. This idea that a manager has a lot of power. The manager doesn't have any more power than any other employee in the city, except that the manager is the boss. The manager only has that authority that this council grants it. That's all that they have. Other than the charter says that they run the day-to-day operations. Council, the political players stay out of the day-to-day operations. That's what this charter does. But the manager, the only power the manager has is the power to run the day-to-day operations based on the policy decisions, the ordinances, the legislation, and everything else that city council imposes on the mayor. And again, if the city manager isn't doing that in the appropriate fashion, the city manager gets fired.
Anyone else with comments or questions or further discussion? Do I have a motion on a form of government?
I make the motion that we accept the council manager form of government.
Do I have a second? Okay, I have a second. I'm going to give it to you since you were the one that asked all the questions. So, Sean, you have another question.
So are we approving just the city council manager government, or are we approving the section 1.01 as written?
Well, I was thinking we would go first with the form of government, and then we could come back to the detailed wording, if that's all right. I mean, was that your understanding? Okay.
Just choose the form, and then we'll look at verbiage.
Okay. So that is the motion on the table. I have a motion and a second. Any further questions? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? None opposed. Okay, now we can discuss the individual wording. And so, Sean, you wanted?
No, I just put that.
Well, is there anyone else who has some wording in here that's causing them concerns or trouble at this point? Or are you willing to go with all of the language as stipulated?
Nance, would we want to say city manager or city administrator?
I'm going to answer that question for you. And this is just experience. If you want to get a qualified, and that, you can tell me if I'm wrong on this, Nancy, but this is what I've heard from the TCMA. This is just what I've heard from TCMA, is that if you want to have the best qualified people apply, you should call it a city manager. It's the state has as a group called the Texas City Managers Association, and they are, for me, I don't care, but for them, they're very touchy about the wording of administrator or manager. And I don't know if I'm wrong about that, but I think I'm right.
Well, and I think also for the public's going to vote on this, they understand the meaning of a city manager, wouldn't you say, Nancy? That's your title, city manager, as opposed to, is it city administrative?
My title is city administrator.
It is.
My experience is typically a city administrator is associated with
General law
a
type
general
A.
law city, whether it's A, B, or C, whatever it may be. City manager is associated with a home rule form of government.
Then some kind of way that needs to be delineated in whatever is voted upon, maybe?
Don't think I understand, Janelle.
Well,
The first line, is that what you're looking at, John L.?
it's, I just noted that city council, manager, government, and then I had another point in there, appointed city officials as noted in the charter. And the city manager is there, but the city administrator isn't exactly explained, so it's.
Well, the city
confusing.
administrator position would go away.
The title
And we
would go
have a city
away.
manager.
Yeah, it wouldn't,
That-
it wouldn't go away. I think really all you're doing is changing the name from
Exactly.
city administrator to city
I
manager.
don't want
And
to
then
I don't want
further into the document, it talks about the city manager.
Yeah, we may do that
Position.
next.
Okay.
So, do I have a motion to accept the wording in section 1.01?
I move that we accept the wording in section 1.01.
Have a motion, do I have a second? Have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Charlie, next item.
So section 1.02 is pretty boilerplate. Really, you don't even need this language in the charter, but folks like to have it in there. It essentially says that that everyone residing within the corporate limits are part of the community, and the community continues to be a municipal body politic under the appropriate name. In this case, obviously, we would change the name. With all the powers, privileges, rights, and duties and immunities provided for in those boundaries. That's basically all it says.
Do I have any discussion? I would recommend we make a motion to approve section 1.02, subject to the appropriate changes to the city of Garden Ridge and the appropriate county. Can I have a motion?
I'll make
Motion, any second?
Second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. Charlie?
Section 103 talks about the extension and reduction of the boundaries. So this is an interesting provision. Technically, Section A is a repeat of state law. A says the boundaries of the city may be enlarged by annexation of additional territory in any manner authorized by law. So it just refers you back to the state law. In the state of Texas, the Texas legislature has dictated very explicitly how we can expand our boundaries. And that's one of the areas in even if you're a home rule city, we have been preempted from extending our boundaries except in compliance with the state law allows us to do so. So A really doesn't even need to be in there, but we put it in there because that's one of these things that folks like to see in the charter. B is a little different. B says that a home rule city may contract its boundaries or reduce the size of its city limits in the former fashion is a paraphrase, as provided for in the charter. There isn't any case law that gives us any guidance on what that means, but I have always taken the position that we should have some language in our charter that talks about how we reduce our boundaries in order to avoid an argument if a city should choose to reduce its boundaries and it's not in the charter, that we don't have the authority because of the way the state law reads. And so this provision is a very simple provision that basically says that in the opinion of the city council, there exists within the corporate limits of the city, either inhabited or uninhabited, not suitable or necessary for city purposes, the city council may, upon a public hearing and by ordinance duly passed, discontinue the territory as part of the city. And so essentially what this section does is it says, hey, there has to be, in order for it to be discontinued, it has to be not suitable or necessary for a public purpose, for a city purpose, and you have to have a public hearing so that the public has an opportunity to come speak, and then you have to adopt an ordinance in order to remove an area from the city limits. I can tell you, in my experience, that I have never had a city, quote unquote, disannex any part of its city limits, except in situations where they're abutting other city limits or abutting other territory, and there's a swap between those two cities. I've done that on multiple occasions where it happens in this near the city of San Antonio all the time because there's these little cities out there. And they'll do a boundary swap because it benefits both cities to do that boundary swap. Like one example is there was, believe it or not, there was a subdivision that was partly in the city of San Antonio and partly in Chavano Park. And then there was this other piece of property. And so they did a boundary swap so that those folks in Chavano Park were now in San Antonio, and then the city of Chavano Park got a little piece of some commercial property that was of value to them. And so it was a boundary swap. So that they didn't technically reduce their boundaries at that time. I think they got more property back than they released, but that's the only time I've seen it. But I put it in here so that in case a situation arises because it becomes necessary, there's no argument as to whether you can do it, and provides an appropriate, what I consider to be an appropriate process.
Are the definitions of ETJ included in the laws so that no more explanation is needed under talking about corporate limits or additional territory?
Yes, sir, that's a great question, and the extraterritorial jurisdiction is explicitly defined within state law and not necessary to further define within this charter.
So on that extension where it says they may be enlarged, is that the referral of those jurisdictions? Is that what that means? Because it doesn't really talk about that specifically, it just says enlarged by annexation.
Right, this is not enlargement of the ETJ. This
Okay.
is enlargement of the city limits.
All right.
The ETJ automatically expands, so the ETJ is set. If you remember from the last discussion, we don't have any control over the size of our ETJ. It's set by population. And so if you're under 5,000, it's a half mile. Once you go over 5,000, it goes to a mile. And it automatically expands every time you annex. So that's how that works.
Any other questions from the commission? Any concerns? Do I have a motion relative to section 1.03?
So moved.
Have a motion to accept? Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion, we'll let Autumn catch this one. Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay, Charlie.
Article 2 is boilerplate unless you believe there is some area where you would like to limit city council's legislative authority. Section 2 essentially says the city has all the powers and rights of self-government that exist now, may exist in the future, including all the implied powers necessary to carry into and execute those powers, unless it's explicitly prohibited or restricted by the charter. So if there is something specific that you believe should be limited, you can put it here, or we can choose to put it somewhere else. But this is just the general grant of power that gives you the power of a home rule city.
Any questions, concerns from the commission? Do I have a motion relative to this section?
Can I make a
Certainly.
question? And Charlie, it's really not about this paragraph, but it's, the other night you talked about that some cities find themselves putting statutory guidance in their city charters, and there's no reason to do
Right.
that. My thought was that we're gonna have citizens of Garden Ridge reading this document, and they may start wondering, why isn't this in the document? Why isn't it in the document? Does there need to be a paragraph that states that we're not going to include Texas statutory guidance in our charter because it's already covered by a state, so that a citizen doesn't look at this and start nitpicking why something isn't in our charter?
I've never done that. We can, I think maybe the appropriate place to maybe put that would be in the preamble. And if the body is interested in doing something like that, I could come up with some
It was
language.
only a thought I had, because it could negate questions from people wondering why there's not something in our charter that's already covered by state statutory legislation, to eliminate having to go back and discuss that and define it. It was only a thought for people to consider.
Yeah, I mean, if I can certainly try to come up with some language if it's the will of this body.
What kind of, I mean, like, if you're saying, I think the idea of the preamble being put there so it sets the tone right off the bat with citizens, what is the sentence that we could add that would cover that?
This charter does not include guidance regarding Texas state statutory guidance. Just so somebody doesn't question why something is not in our city charter that's already covered by state legislature. That was only my thought. Something that, it doesn't have to be specific, but you talked about it the other night and it resonated with me that if I'm trying to explain this to average Joe and they start wanting to know why we don't have something in there, we don't have to say, well, it's already covered by state statute or state legislature.
If I could follow on to that, I like the concept of educating our citizens, and I'm brainstorming now. One of the things I saw that was effective in the Quarry Commission was putting together frequently asked questions as a way to educate people. And rather than perhaps putting in here, which may be the right place, but start building now these questions that we have, because citizens are going to ask those questions. And we are going to have to sell this to them. So I think we ought to start building that file of frequently asked questions that answer those kinds of things. For example, there are things not in here about ETJs because it's in the state law and we don't need it in here. We don't need to have everything prescribed because state law covers the rest. Something along those lines to educate people to do that, because I think you're spot on. We're going to have lots of questions. Just a thought.
I don't disagree with Wayne on that. This will be a historical document. Frequently asked questions will not, but the rubber will meet the road in our first election, first vote, where people read this to make decisions. And I think they need to have a good understanding of what it is and what it isn't, and what's insidious and what's not. And so I don't disagree with Wayne on that, but it was a comment that Charlie made that hit me like, well, I don't want people to start questioning why we don't have something in a city charter, and we got to then explain to them, well, it's covered by the state legislature.
Yeah, we kind of try to do that in this first sentence, and maybe it could be written better, but this first sentence, it's sort of the intention to say that, well, I'll just read it. The city shall have all powers and rights of self-government and home rule that exists now or may be granted to municipalities, and this is the section I'm talking, the words I'm talking about, by the Constitution and laws of the state of Texas. So that section right there is supposed to be saying, look, there are laws out there, and we are accepting, we are incorporating all that into our powers, and that's kind of what it's supposed to say. But we could change it to by the Constitution of the laws of the state of Texas to include statutes, codes, et cetera, so that it's a little clearer, because maybe it could clear it up, but it's up to y'all.
Well, I like the sentence in accordance with the Constitution and statutes of state of Texas. I think those two key words are enough.
Is that something we can add into the preamble?
That is
Yes.
in the preamble.
Reiterating
Yeah, that's
those-
line,
that
yeah,
line specifically.
line 9 on the preamble.
I also think that if you get someone that's gonna be asking these types of questions that are really wanting to dig in, they're gonna have to be automatically pointed in the direction of, you need to read state laws, that type of a thing. So I think it's a person that truly wants to know more and dig deeper is gonna have to be directed in that way anyways, but maybe adding that little bit into the preamble might help people understand that this is a,
Based on the discussion, I rescind my comment. I do think it's covered, but I agree with Wayne that sometimes you gotta dumb this down so that we don't find ourselves getting bogged down in questions that explaining something. It's a frequently asked question, so.
And
What
just I haven't talked to Nancy or the mayor, but typically what we would do, once y'all go through this process, is because the election has to be called by February 17th or something like that, I always recommend that, you can't advocate for or against, but you can explain. And so I always recommend you take a little road show out there. First, you have some public hearings in your chambers with city council, so people can answer questions. You have the people to answer the questions. And then you do a little road show. I don't know, fortunately or unfortunately, I don't know what your local community clubs are, but if you've got a local Rotary Club or Lions Club or a church, or if you've got some major homeowners associations, you go on a little road show and you make those stops with those folks, not to advocate for or against, but to explain. And then you also have a FAQ. And we did that. I can give examples of all that, so.
Well, what I'm hearing from the commission, if I might say, sounds like everyone seems to really like Wayne's idea of maybe starting to develop this FAQ. Is that something you would like to start? We can start collecting that. And so, Jim, what I'd like to ask you to do is, can you just pencil out your question that might go into the form of a FAQ that we could then start as our first building block for the FAQ that would help resolve that
I will
concern?
do that, and then we can collect them along the way and then decide later whether they're of value or no value, but at least we're collecting them along the way.
Well, I'd like you to word yours, because you worded it so well. My
And I'm
notes-
gonna word it right now.
Very good. Are there any other comments on? Sure.
Jim, I thought that was a good discussion. And Wayne, I love what you added to that. My guess is based on our schedule and how well you guys are doing just last on Monday night and then tonight, that we'll be able to get through this in our meeting schedule. And we may have some meetings that we're done with the boilerplate, we put the charter together, and then we can get into, put it into agenda like on January 25th. If all of this is done, we can talk about how we are going to educate the citizens of Garden Ridge to prepare for this to be on the ballot and actually talk about it as a commission. So I think that's a really good point.
Thank you, Mayor. So do I have a motion relative to the language on section 2.01?
I make the motion that we accept the words on section 2.01.
Do I have a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
So this is a big one, right? 3.01, City Council, composition and term. So Section A deals with the composition of the City Council. It has a mayor and 5 council members. And so that's your first discussion point. Do you keep the size of the council the same? And, or do you increase it? Now, what goes along with that discussion oftentimes is whether or not the mayor has the right to vote. And let me explain to you why that often goes with that conversation. Currently, you have 5 council members and a mayor. The mayor does not vote. There's no chance for a tie. And unless someone's absent, right? And if there is a tie, then the mayor gets to break the tie. If you don't add another council member, but you give the mayor the right to vote, now you have an opportunity for a tie every time you vote with no chance for anybody to break the tie. My personal opinion is that's not a bad thing. It is purely a policy decision, but all it means is that you couldn't get more than 4 people to agree that this was a good idea, right? That's what it means, essentially. And when you do it that way, and I'm not advocating for or against either, I'm just not. Just so everybody knows, I'm not advocating for or against any particular position. And so if you give the mayor the right to vote and you keep it with 5 council members and the mayor, it's always going to be 6. And instead of having to have 3 people approve something in order for it to be adopted, right? If you've got 5, majority of 5 is 3. It takes 3 people to adopt legislation. If you give the mayor the right to vote and you keep it with 5 council members and the mayor, it's always going to take, if it's a full council, at least 4 people to agree that it should be adopted. So it is essentially a supermajority vote every time you want to adopt legislation. There's pros and cons to that I'm sure you can think about and discuss amongst yourself. But those are key things that happen. If you give the mayor the right to vote and you keep it the same way, it's always going to take, if it's a full council at the meeting, at least 4 folks. And depending on how you handle other sections of the charter, it may always require 4 people, because some charters actually state it takes a certain number to always adopt something. What does that mean? The way it works now, it's the number of people present and voting that gets things adopted. So if you have a council meeting and you only have 3 council members present and the mayor, it just takes 2 people to adopt anything, because there's only 3 present, right? 2 present and voting gets something adopted, 2 gets it adopted if there's only 3 people there. If there's 4 people there, you still need 3. But if there's 3, you need 4. Some charters say it always requires a majority vote of the governing body to adopt something, to avoid what they perceive to be having something adopted on such a small majority. Sort of an aside. So as you're thinking about the number of folks that you want on this dais, and you're thinking about, it might be a good idea to think about whether or not you want to have the mayor have the right to vote as well, because that's going to be part of this discussion based on what I just told you. Does anybody have any, I hope I explained that in a way that was understandable.
So Charlie, if the mayor has a right to vote, which could result in a tie, what is the current process to break that tie?
There would be no process, it would just fail. And that means they would have to come up with another motion or some other, another motion, but another way to solve the problem or to handle what they want to handle. In my mind, this idea that every time a motion is made, and it has to be either it has to be approved by a certain number of folks, and if there's a tie, well, you've got to have a tiebreaker. In my mind, that's weird, but to other people, it's not. It's appropriate. But if there's an even number of folks, there's no tiebreaker, and the mayor votes, there's no tiebreaker. It just fails, and they've got to figure out another way to solve the problem.
Mayor, would you like to come forward and talk a little bit about what currently exists and how it works, et cetera?
Thanks, Nadine. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. So, and I want to hear what you guys have to say. So, you already know my opinion that the way we do it currently, I don't have the mayor, office of the mayor does not have the right to vote unless we need to break a tie. That hasn't occurred in the 18 months that I've been in the seat. And I can count on, as the consensus builder, as the person that can present both sides of the situation of the ordinance, of what's presented before the council, and be kind of the administrator of that discussion and of the vote. I can count on one hand the number of votes that haven't been unanimous in all things, everything we voted on in 18 months in Garden Ridge for a council, in the affirmative or in the negative. And I'd like to hear the discussion, though, from you guys on this one, rather than coming out and telling you exactly what we want, although I said if it ain't broke, don't fix it, because that pretty much tells you what I'm thinking, but I'd like to hear the discussion.
Well, I'm really opinionated on this because as an HOA president, there's 5 of us, and I'm one of 5, and I get to vote on everything. And so my first thought was not to give the mayor a vote, but then after when Charlie was saying, I like the idea of a majority of 4. When we have things that are put before the city council, and sometimes you don't know, I don't know what your attendance is. Is it 100%? You get a quorum every time? I mean, not a quorum, but all 5 show up. I mean, I've seen some of your documents where you have 1 missing every so often. So I kind of like the idea of a supermajority. Having said that, I came here thinking I wouldn't give the mayor a vote, but now as I thought about it, I get a vote every time, but I'm one of 5 in a HOA. And you also have that power of persuasion. You're going to know, that was why I didn't want, I gave you the vote, because of that power of persuasion. However, you're more informed in more ways than a city council member may be. And if there is a tie, that just means more discussion for the council. Means more research, maybe more rewording of it. A tie isn't a bad thing. You just go back and do more homework. So that's my opinion.
Okay.
I don't disagree with that. Another thing to think about is wanting to make this very streamlined so it gets passed. And I think once we start changing things like this, it can make people nervous, and they may not want to vote on accepting a home rule document because they don't want to change what isn't broke.
So are you saying that the office of the mayor has a vote, or just a tie-break vote?
Currently what we have now, the tiebreaker.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Well, there is no tiebreaker if it's 5 and all 5 show up. The tiebreaker only comes into play if somebody doesn't show up, and then the mayor becomes the tiebreaker. So we elect our councilmen, and hopefully they're going to show up to meetings and vote. I mean, that's a...
The only time that we have had absences have been vacations, so in the summer, or something has happened and they can't attend the meeting.
and just to be, for full transparency, there could be occasions where everybody shows up and you could still result in a tie. And that's when there's some conflict that requires the council member to recuse themselves from voting.
Very true. What's Armando's opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of the mayor being a consensus builder, being objective, and so leaving the system as we have it today is what I would prefer.
Janelle?
And one of the situations that we have had in the past is some of the council members have abstained from voting. They said, I choose not to vote. And even though they're sitting right here on the podium, so.
And you can, so I have a little pet peeve. I don't know anything about anything that's happened in Garden Ridge, but because I don't come to the meetings. So this is not at all a comment on the city council of Garden Ridge. But one of my pet peeves is council members who abstain from voting when they don't have an actual conflict of interest under the law. When they have an actual conflict of interest under the law, they are required to abstain from vote. They are required to file a document stating they have the conflict, stating why they have the conflict, and then not only abstain from vote, but abstain from participating in discussion. So they're supposed to abstain from all of it. One of my biggest pet peeves is council members just choosing not to vote because they don't want to have to cast a vote on a hard decision and just sitting back and go, well, I'm just, that's scary. I'm going to abstain from this vote. In my mind, that does two things. One, the first thing it does is tells me that person probably shouldn't be sitting on that dais because they weren't elected to abstain. They were elected to make the hard decisions. Two, when someone actually has a conflict of interest under the law, that means they're not present for the purposes of the vote, all right, under the law. And so it changes how the vote happens, all right? When somebody abstains, they're still present, but they don't have a legal conflict of interest. They're still present for the vote pursuant to the law, which means that essentially they've just voted no by abstaining. And so I'll get off my soapbox. But there are real consequences for abstaining when you don't have an actual legal conflict of interest. And when you do have an actual legal conflict of interest, it does change how the vote happens, especially if there's two and you've got 5 people present. Because, so let me give the example to make it clear. If you've got 5 people present, all your council is present. 2 people abstain, but they don't have an actual conflict of interest, they just don't want to vote, right? That means if it's those present and voting that carries the day, it still takes 3, right? Because there's still 5 people present and voting under the law under that circumstance. It still takes 3. But if 2 of them have an actual conflict of interest, then they're not counted towards the quorum for the purpose of that vote, which means present and voting carries the day, it only takes 2. Does that make sense? So there are actual consequences for those types of activities.
I just want to say that in our meeting today, I was very happy to hear that the city has really cracked down on abstentions. So
Yeah.
some of the stuff we might have seen in the past, we have a
And you can
tough
put it in your
officer over
charter.
there
You
who,
can put it in your charter that, and charters have done that, where it actually says, all council members shall vote on all actions that come before them unless they have an actual conflict of interest under the law and comply with the conflict of interest statute, which means they can no longer sit back and go, I abstain, because the charter disallows it.
And we'll cover that in section 310 of this document. And that is covered in our new ethics ordinance that we passed last April as well. So to ensure exactly what Charlie said, that doesn't happen.
Oh, yeah, Stockton has it in their charter. Mhm.
I think we were making the rounds here of positions, and I've honestly lost track. I know Sean had a comment.
The mayor, not broken, fix it. I agree with the way it is right now. And I'm honestly worried about stalemates, right? You have an issue that's very critical to the city. If you have a tie that can't be broken and nothing's ever changed and it's a very important issue, then and you have a real problem.
So has everybody spoken at this point on the topic? Well, I'll speak on the topic. I think we ought to leave it alone, and I think the mayor should not have a vote. I think it's exactly what Diana said. That's my perspective of the mayor, that the real power of the mayor is to have that contact with the citizenry and the ability to help the council reach consensus. So on that light, it looks like that's the wording that we would like to see, Charlie.
So in A, so,
One question before we move on the 5 city council, we can make a decision of, or more or less. I just have a question. When you have places 1 through 5, are those jurisdictions or they're just places in the chair?
They're at large.
Okay.
So to hear the official position of the city in our discussion today, so we want to keep it the same as it is right now. The mayor only votes in the case of a tie, so that the office of the mayor can be that consensus builder, can build those relationships when some hard discussions need to happen. And that, in our opinion, that protects the council, it protects the city manager, city administrator in this case, and the city of Garden Ridge. So, because there are some hard decisions, Sean, as you know, that need to be made sometimes regarding building and zoning and whatnot. So, with the mayor not having a vote, it's better for the city in our opinion.
So I think before we finalize section 301A, Charlie, are you going to need to go back and make some changes to wording there? Or?
no, 301A is absolutely fine, but I have gone to section 304 to make a change when we get to it that will reflect the discussion we just had about the mayor vote.
So, that being said, I would like to have a motion on 301A. Can I get a motion to accept the wording as written?
Make a motion.
Thank you, Mondo. Do I have a second? Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. With that, we're on to 301B, sorry.
And so 301B is the term of office. The city of Fort Stockton chose to change their terms from 2-year terms to 3-year terms. But section B is where you will determine the term of not the length of the term of office. You're currently at 2 years, and now I'll open it up to discussion.
I know there was some discussion about why cities might go to 3. It had to do with how quickly I guess you say the chairs turn over and how quickly the elections. Mayor, do you have any feedback on this particular item that you'd like to share with the commission?
Like before, Nadine, if we could, I'd like to, before I give my opinion in the official stance of the city, I'd like to hear what you guys have to say as citizens and our commissioners.
Well, then I'll open the floor to the commissioners. Who would like to start?
Well, I'm opinionated again. I know on my HOA, we have a 3-year term. It takes the first year for everyone to get on board. And so we don't meet once a month always. We did in the beginning, once a month, 12 months in a row. But as we have gotten better and better at it, and we've solidified, we now meet maybe once every 2 months. So we don't have that, it takes them a year just to get on board and understand what we need to do, to know their neighbors, to do this or do that. But in the city, I don't know how much you meet every month. How much do you get to really know your job in that first year? And then you have 1 year where you're probably doing a really good job and then you're out. Or if you decide to volunteer again. I don't know how big the volunteer pool is. It's hard for me to find HOA people on the board. Very difficult. I have to go and beg people and promise them all sorts of things. And then I work my tail off so that I'm not throwing all the work on them. But in that respect, I'd like to know what a 2-year city council member faces versus a 3-year in getting to know the job.
Okay, so without giving away the position, I would say that it doesn't take as long as I originally thought to learn what happens it depends on who's up there and a lot with how the meeting is conducted and run. But it doesn't take too long to learn the process of what the job of a council member is. Much the same as we're on our second meeting and you guys all know what you're doing. So there is the thought out there that, you know, hey, you kind of you try to figure it out in a year, and then suddenly the second year as you're hitting your stride, you're running for office again. Why wouldn't you want another year? Well, no, that's a valid point. So there's also the, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So I'm not going to give away my thought process, but I want to hear the discussion.
Yeah, my wife's an HOA president as well, and I don't want to belittle city council or mayor, but there's a lot more involved with HOA than there is with, from my perspective. So I think that's why, plus finding people to volunteer to do the job is also very difficult. And I'm sure it is as well for getting people citizens to run for office is also very difficult. But personally, I think we just need to leave it at 2 years. Hopefully in the future, we get some new blood, some people who are, ambitious and want to help the city improve. And giving the opportunity to have elections every 2 years, I think, enhances that opportunity.
You bet. Thanks, Armando.
So I just kind of disagree with that, and I disagree with what you said also about the council members get caught up pretty quickly. I mean, there's a lot of things that runs the city, right? You got your police department, you got your utilities, you got your HR department, you got all these different aspects in the city. And if you have some ordinance that you're working on in the utilities department, that could take 3 or 4 months to get to the council and get passed. I mean, you're talking, it takes a long time sometimes to get some of these things passed. And I don't think 2 years is long enough. I personally think a 3-year term is better because you can really get more things accomplished or see more things through, in my opinion. I think there's a lot more to it than what you're doing.
Okay. No, that's a great opinion.
I'm Jim. I would add to that I was developed in the military. I was a commander, as a leader, and every 2 years I was moved to another assignment. And when I went in to take an organization or to a position, the first year you're really just trying to understand the agenda the guy behind you or the gal behind you was executing. So it takes some time, regardless, and I was in the job day to day, not month to month, to understand what the real agenda was and why that agenda was being executed. And it took me some time to develop a new agenda to better the organization. But by the time I got that agenda developed and communicated, it was time to leave. And somebody else was coming in to do the same thing I just did. So my thought on the surface is 3 years allows somebody to understand the agenda, the issues, develop it, and then build it and grow it and then execute it. And then it gives the citizens the time to look at that person to say, did they do what they were said they were going to do, and did they have the time to execute it? And if the answer is no, you vote them out of office and you bring somebody else in. So I guess in this short time, my opinion is I think 3 years, especially in our time of life, 3 years goes by that quick. It does. It goes by that quick. And you can take a year to get comfortable, and then you're a lame duck for a year and you're out. And I'm up for election. And so I think to put meat on the bone, 3 years is an appropriate amount of time to give somebody, because my understanding is also under this process, there is the ability to do what's called a recall, where if you don't think somebody's doing their job right, you can get enough people together to say, get him out of the office and get somebody else in there. So I don't know that process, but I just personally feel 2 years is the blink of an eye. And it doesn't give people the ability to really get their feet in the ground and move forward on whatever the agenda is, and then have the time to prove they can execute it.
I agree with almost everything I've heard. It's pros and cons of each, but in my book, I lean towards the effort that goes into the election process and time doing that instead of doing other things. And I look at the experience, and following on Jim's conversation, the quality of the experience is better of what you learn to do and how you do it. Because when you first come in, you take a lot of stuff, you learn stuff, you get a perspective from being a new person. That will change over time. Plus, it gives you a chance to develop quality relationships with the other board members, with the mayor, with the citizenry, that you won't have over 2 years because you're having to relearn and redo all that with somebody new. So I agree with the thought process of 2 years, but I prefer 3 years.
2 years is a high turnover rate, and also my husband being in the military, it's hard on the people that work, so it'd be hard on the city to constantly have a high turnover rate. With that being said, I think this is the number that voters are gonna notice, that the big change that we're changing the mayor from 2 to 3 years, council members from 2 to 3 years. So I think this is something that voters are gonna either be on board with or not on board with, especially if they did not vote for the current mayor or they're not happy with how the council members are voting. This could easily vote down the home rule option.
Who hasn't spoken? Janelle, did you?
No, I haven't, but real quick, I like the 2 year simply because if you have somebody in that office and they wanted to get there to begin with, then they want to get there the next time. So having a new election for them or whatever it takes to keep them in there, they're going to continue to fight for what they're doing. They're not going in to be kicked out for 2 years. They're going in, they want to get to the bone. So with the 2 year thing as a start, and then in the end, it should finish.
Well, I'll go ahead and put my 2 cents in. And I'm like Wayne, I agree with everything that you said, both on the 3 and on the 2. But I think I picked up on Autumn's bit about this is gonna be something that people are gonna see. And I think if you change it to 3, they might come back and say, oh, is that what they're trying to do? Trying to stay in there longer. I think the big difference between being new on a council and being new on a commission or probably an HOA is on a commission and an HOA, somebody approaches you to be on that body. And so you go into it generally not knowing a whole lot. If you decide to run for office, you have to pick up pretty quickly and do a lot of homework in the time period when you file between January and February and the election in May. So if you're halfway decent, you've done, several months worth of work and study that, yeah, it's not when you were on the clock, but you were there. So I incline to say, it ain't broke, don't fix it. The other thing is, I'm a firm proponent that the biggest way to encourage not having a recall is to be able to frequently use the ballot box to either put people in office or take people out of office. I'm not real fond of recalls in general, just because of the turmoil that it stirs up in communities. So I'm for keeping it short and sweet, and I would prefer, I think, 2 years. But I'm not a voting member on this commission, so.
I have a question based on what Autumn said about extending the term. If we change it to 3, you don't automatically get an extra year, I assume. No. Right, so, they would have to be written some way, somehow, if we did decide to take it to 3, the term would not be extended, I would assume.
Yeah, so the way that would most likely work is if the decision was to go from 2-year to 3-year terms, then this next election, because we have to say for all the positions of the mayor, council place 2, council place 3, that the positions are for a 2-year term. So regardless of the outcome of May 6th ballot on home rule charter, all of those positions are 2-year terms going forward. So, and if we did change to 3-year terms, then we'd have to talk about how we're gonna do it with place 1, 4, and 5 that just had an election.
Yeah, there would be, we would include, if you did go to 3 years, we would include transitional language in the charter as to how that would
Like they
occur.
have right for Charlie has.
I just have one, I'm sorry. Question, not to put you on the spot, but I'm gonna put you on the spot. Did you want to be mayor because it's a 2-year? Would you have done it if it was a 3-year?
Yes to both. So, I mean, we didn't have a choice. It is 2 years, so, but I would have run regardless.
But if we decide for 2 years right now, because of what Autumn said, and I think that's 2 years from now, we can go in and file an amendment to change it to 3 years, because the citizens have already absorbed the bulk of a charter, and now we're just fine tuning the edges.
Charlie, do you know why so many cities are starting to move to the 3 years? It seems like-
For many of the reasons that were stated here, that it gives you the ability, projects take a long time. And so it gives, especially as your city grows, so it gives the elected officials time to work on those projects and see those projects through to transition with, without losing corporate knowledge as part of the process. The idea that it takes for the newly elected, it takes a year to really get your feet on the ground, and then once you do that, like all of a sudden you're running for election again. And then for those who have been elected, well, once I get reelected, I'm running for office again. So they feel like they're constantly. I hear that a lot. All I'm doing is I'm running for office. It's a 2-year term, and all I do is run for office. Now, I don't have to run for office, so it doesn't make a difference to me one way or the other. But the reasons you've just stated are the main reasons that I hear. The feeling of perpetual having to run for office, the maintaining of corporate knowledge over time. Because remember, it would be staggered terms. So you would maintain some, 3 years of knowledge times however many people on the council continually over time. And then these projects just take time to get going. Those are the reasons why I hear folks make that. Those were the exact reasons that were stated why Fort Stockton decided to make the change.
Maybe. One more comment. To give you a quick scenario, just for our subdivision, the then president said, we're going to change stop signs. Took her 3 years to fix get them painted and everything done. 3 years to paint all our stop signs, okay? Just because she has a full-time job, this HOA president wasn't her #1 list to do, and it just took time for people to get there and do it. The other thing said, though, is when you get someone on the council who does abstain or doesn't show up, they have a record of absence, they're out of there in 2 years. So that's the good point. However, I think the time of projects, I'm either way. I would go either way with the majority, but I would still think I like the 3-year.
Mary, you wanted to hear the discussion.
did. No,
Now,
it's a-
now shall we put you on the spot?
Fantastic discussion. I love it. And I agree with everything that all of you said. So, and I'm not saying that as hey, Rob, you're a politician. I'm not. I'm saying I agree. And I am not. And we had the exact same discussion today in my office that we talked about earlier. And we went back and forth between 2-year terms, 3-year terms. And what we came to a consensus with was to remain 2-year terms. Some of that is, Jim, to quote you again, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I like the term. Autumn, I think your point is very valid, that hey, this is suddenly a change. Why? Oh, you guys want to stay in office longer, which is not, wouldn't be the case as we already discussed for everyone that's up for election in this cycle.
And not only that, y'all don't get to make the decision. These folks are deciding whether it's 2 years or 3 terms, not city council. Yeah.
Right, so I'm just giving you what our opinion, our consensus was. You guys get to decide this. So some thoughts. The 2-year term is its own built-in recall process. We'll get into the recall process in the coming meetings, coming weeks. But a 2-year term would maybe take away the need for a recall because you're not in office that long. One of the things too is I worry about limiting our pool of viable candidates in a city of 5,000 people, 5,000 inhabitants, right? We don't have San Antonio. We don't have District 10, Clayton Perry's district from San Antonio as a, 100,000, not quite 100,000 people, but almost 50,000 people. So we have 5,000 people and inhabitants, and that's not every one of those 5,000 can run for office, right? So there is a, rather than a 3-year term, there is perhaps a 2-year term. Hey, I'm gonna go try this and I'm gonna do it for 2 years. I was originally appointed to council back in March of 2017. And because there was the election, no one was running, we had to cancel the election, so I automatically rolled into a new term. But part of my decision-making process was, well, it's 2 years. And like you said, Jim, 2 or 3 years goes by in a blink, and it did. But I was very pleased with that 2 years. It took a lot of study to get up to speed, because certainly with the person I was replacing was Shelby Trial. And, stalwart, and huge knowledge base and experience. And here I am, that first meeting, remember that, Nadine, coming in March of 2017, going, what have I done? So I chose not to run for re-election, if you will, or election in 2019 because my term was expiring and my daughter Maggie was going to be a senior in high school. And with just meetings, so we have 7 scheduled meetings, and we're going on our 5th hour of meeting here in 2 nights right now. You think of 12 council meetings a year, plus I had a commission meeting that I was the ex officio of, my study time, all the extra events, and it was 34 nights of her senior year I wouldn't be available to be around her, and I didn't want to miss any of Maggie's senior year. So I chose not to run for re-election. That's exactly what I told Mayor Thompson at the time. Hey, Larry, this is why. And he's like, well, that's a great reason, Rob. We're going to miss you. But it gave the city a great opportunity to have Lisa Swin step up and run, and she was elected into my old spot of place too. And look at how fortunate we are to have Lisa Swin on the council and all of our council members. So with those thoughts, and one final one is that the election process is a good thing. And going through a campaign and an election process, you have to be all in. And so if you run a campaign and are elected into an office, you have already done some heavy lifting and homework to study to be a viable candidate. So when you hit the dais, you are ready to go. Kay has tremendous experience in council place 5, was recently reelected, but going through the campaign process, she was out there studying, walking door to door, talking about what's going on in the city, and you relearn or you learn about your position. So the election process, in my opinion, is a good thing. Am I looking forward to the possibility of another campaign? Yes and no, but I look forward to that discussion and learning more and talking to the citizens out there. So what we came up with as a consensus was to keep it at 2 years for all of the reasons that we have discussed. 3 years is also a viable option. But personally, the city, the consensus from the city is to leave it at 2-year terms right now. Any questions for me on that?
Thank you, Mayor.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think, depending upon how the commission decides on this, we may or may not need some wording. So I think I would like a motion relative to length of term, and then we'll see what kind of wording issues we have.
I move we establish the length of term for council members at 2 years.
I have a motion to establish for 2 years. Do I have a second?
I second.
I have a motion and a second. All those in favor of 2-year terms say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. So we've elected to stay with the 2-year term. So Charlie, will you make whatever necessary adjustments need to be made to section 3.01? And then we will take that up at our next meeting with the wordings that you come up with, or are you
Yeah.
gonna hold
It'll be
that
very
up till
simple.
later?
I'll just change it from 3 years to 2 years.
Charlie, a question that, and I'm sorry, I'm not the fastest reader, but as I was reading the documents, did I read something correctly that if you go to a council manager form of government, you have to establish wards?
No, that's not
No,
accurate.
okay.
And so C is not going to be relevant because that language would only be necessary if you changed your terms. And that means we're moving on to section 3.02, which is term limits.
So we'll see, be struck.
Yeah, it'll be struck. We won't, yeah, you don't even need to vote on it or anything. It's not, it just wouldn't, it's not relevant.
We won't put it in there at all.
Won't put it in there at all. Which means we move on to 3.02, limitations on terms, term limits.
I did have a question when I read that.
Mm-hmm.
It says aldermen. Is that what they used as council members in Fort Stockton before they transferred to?
Yes.
Is that what, okay.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So 3.02, it's not necessary, but they decided to be very explicit that there's no term limits. So if you would like to place term limits, that's a discussion to have. If you don't, you can keep this language, or you don't need, it doesn't need to explicitly state that there's no term limits.
So we can either be silent on the issue of term limits, or we can leave this in, is what you're saying, if we decide not to do.
If you
term
decide
limits.
not to, yes.
Open for discussion relative to term limits. What's the pleasure of the commission?
Well, I noticed in that one document where there tends to be like a number of, I think 12 years was probably one of the more favorable times, the 12 years total. I forgot to mention that I had been on a HOA when I was in Auburn, Alabama. So over 10 years there, 10 years here, I've only had one person I met that was on there way too long. Only one person out of all that time. So, maybe a term limit isn't important.
I tend to agree with her because court commission existed because, and it did what it did. And the term limits were kind of an issue, but we were able to get around it or through it. So no term limits.
So do I have a motion relative to section 3.02?
I actually have one other question.
Oh, sure.
For
Sorry.
the mayor or Nancy. The other commissions, like the planning zoning commissions, court commissions, they had term limits at one point, I think, right? Do they still have those term limits?
No, there's no more term limits on any of the commissions.
Thank you.
So would this impact what our words here, would that impact commissions or not? This is strictly for city council and mayor. Okay.
So do I have a motion on 302
I'll make a motion to approve 302.
as written? Have a motion and a second? Do I have a second?
A second.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All in favor, say aye. Any opposed, motion carries. Section 3.03,
3.03 is qualifications of city council. So state law allows you to change a couple of the state law qualifications. The first is the age of someone to be qualified to run for office. I think it's 21 in state law, but you can take it down to 18. And the second thing that you can change is the amount of time you're required to live within the jurisdiction. I think it says, I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm very embarrassed. I think it's 1 year under state law qualifications, and you can take it down to 6 months. And then there are some other, because you would be a home rule city, you can add additional qualifications, and Fort Stockton did, and I thought what would be good is we look at is that we look at 303, because what 303 says is, in addition to any other qualifications prescribed by law, which are the state law qualifications, the mayor and council members shall meet the qualifications set forth in section 5.02. So we can go to 5.02 so you can look at those other qualifications. So if everybody's ready to do that. So 5.02 B provides additional qualifications. You have to be 21 years of age on the first day of the term to be filled at the election. So is state law 18? I can't remember. I think state law is 18 and they changed it to 21. I'll double check that. I'll pull it up in a second. I don't have all this stuff memorized perfectly. I just generally know where it's at because I've been doing it too long. 2 is a repeat of state law, so I don't, there's some things in here that I actually said you don't need it, but they decided to put it in anyway, and that's fine, but this is a recitation of state law. Number 2 is, this is the big one. They added a qualification that you shall not have been recalled from city council within 3 years preceding the date of the election or appointment as applicable and the end of the term during which they were recalled. So they included a provision in here that if you've been recalled, you are not eligible or qualified to run for city council for a 3-year period. And they chose that 3-year period because that was consistent with the terms. So they felt if you have been recalled, you need to set out at least the length of a term before you're eligible again. And then it provides in here that this is one of those things where this is also the law, but they wanted to make clear in the charter, so it was written in the charter, that you can only file for one single elective city office at one time, even though that's the law. That was one of those things where I said, that's the law, that's in the statute, and they're like, well, how are they gonna know it if it's not in the charter? And I said, well, okay, put it in the charter.
I can't hear that. What was that first sentence?
That's a recitation of law. You can only run for one elective office at a time. And I told them that. I said, that's statutory, it's the law already. And they said, well, how is anybody going to know it if it's not in the charter? And I said, well, then just put it in the charter. So they did.
what happens to a charter when the state law is changed? How does it?
Right, which is why I don't like reciting state law in the charter, because if state law changes, then you've got a conflict with state law, but it's still in your charter. And then what happens is someone goes, how come we can't do that? It's in our charter. And then we have to tell people, well, that's because the state law changed. And then we have to go back and show them the state law, and everybody's confused. And that's why I don't like reciting state law in the.
So would your preference be to not include 2 and 4?
Yeah, I would not. I mean, if my advice actually was not to And of course, this was just theirs. This was just their recommendations. But 2 and 4 are a complete recitation. Well, hold on, before I do 2, it may be, because what I can't remember is what is the state law on qualifications for office? I can't remember if it's
So
qualifications for office.
for a mayor candidate, you must have resided in the state of Texas for at least 12 months and in the city of Gardner Ridge for at least 12 months. For a council member in a type A general law city, so I don't know if that would change with the home rule.
Yeah, so here it is. So Chapter 141 of the Texas Elections Code states, eligibility for election or appointment to public elective office in the state. So this would be applicable to a city council. Be a United States citizen, be 18 years of age or older on the first day of the term to be filled at the election or on the date of appointment as applicable, have not been determined by final judgment or court to be totally mentally incapacitated or partially incapacitated without the right to vote, have not been finally convicted of a felony in which the person has not been pardoned or otherwise released from their disabilities, have resided continuously in the state for 12 months and in the territory from which the office is elected for 6 months immediately preceding the following date. And then it's got a list of how that plays out, depending on if you're an independent candidate, write-in candidate, or if you're just appearing on the ballot as in a general primary election. And then 7 is satisfy any other eligibility requirements prescribed by law for the office, and that's where that other one files in. So they raised it from 18 to 21, and they raised the requirement to live within the corporate limits or an annexed area from, that's exactly the same. Resided continuously in the state for 12 months and in the territory for 6 months. So they raised from having to live in the city limits for 6 months to 12 months. So they made both of those changes. They raised the age to 18, from 18 to 21, and they increased the time necessary to live in the city limits from 6 months to 12 months. Those are really the two things in state law that you can change. How old do you have to be, and how long do you have to live in the city limits before you're qualified?
From a commission's perspective, how do y'all feel about changing the age limit from what the state statute has? I mean, that seems to be, if we wanted to go with what Fort Stockton had, we would raise it to 21 rather than 18. Or we could just stay with state law, which would be 18.
Yeah, I think going with state law would probably be easier. Also, I don't think we have a big threat in Gardner
I like
Ridge
state
for
law.
18-year-olds.
I think there's young adults these days that are advancing, we think 21 in our age group, but some of these young adults that are accelerating through school, graduating early, we'd just be bridling them. So why go against state law? Give them that opportunity, and then it's up to the voters.
And then how about the length of time residing within the corporate limits? Do y'all want to change it? State law is 6 months, and we would change it to 12, or what?
I thought you said state law was 12 months.
I got confused.
Charlotte?
State law is 6, so state law says you have to live in the state for
Oh,
12
six.
months.
12
But
months.
within the jurisdiction from where you're being elected for 6 months.
Oh.
But you can raise that to 12 months.
So what is the commission's pleasure with regard to?
Say state law,
Just
good
stay
for
with
me.
state law, so basically 12 months within the state, 6 months within Garden Ridge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So basically, we would be removing items 1 and 2B. Now, I
Right.
guess 3, we could hold off on
We can
that
hold off on that
until we get to the recall.
till you get to the recall, and then you don't need C.
Okay, so basically, assuming, well, we'll have to deal with the recall situation,
Right.
but
And so then, with that said, those are the important things. What we can do, if you think that you're gonna add different well, actually, what we could do is we could put it in the same section. So, with all of that said,
My comment on 3, I know it's here, so it's in front of us, but to put a time limit on that, if we're in 2-year terms, if somebody was recalled after, let's say, a year, and we have a time limit of 2 years, well, they could run at the next election because they would still be within the term. So I just, the years bothers me a little bit rather than, I mean, if we're taking somebody, if the voters are taking somebody out of office because of, for some reason, and you give a time frame, the next election could come up shortly after that time frame, and that person could run again when you're defining it by years rather than term limits.
Yeah.
Just
I
a
think
thought
that-
for discussion. I don't know if we're gonna.
Yeah, I think those are 100% valid points in consideration. Here's what I would do if I was you. When we get to the recall section, you should have a healthy debate as to whether or not you want to include recall in a charter where you have 2-year terms. And then if you do have recall, are there limitations? Because typically the limitations are, that I see, is there's a period of time after you get elected where you're not subject to recall. And they do that to avoid, people retaliating because their candidate didn't get elected, and they're like, okay, we're not gonna have a recall election, immediately after someone's elected. And that time is anywhere, 6 months to 9 months. So let's say it's 6 months. And then there's typically a prohibition on a recall 6 months or 9 months before the term ends, because recall elections are expensive and you don't want to hold a special election to recall somebody in November sometimes when their term is up in May, because what's an election cost you? So, a recall election in November for $10,000 if they're up for re-election in November. So they think, well, it's okay, so we'll put a buffer on that. 6 months on this side, 6 months on this side. And so then there's a 1-year period in that 2 years, where you might have a recall election. And because you can only hold a recall election on a uniform election date, within that uniform period, within that 1-year period, there's only 2 dates where you can hold that election. One in May and one in November. And so anyway, there's a lot of policy considerations for you to think about in a recall situation when you have 2-year terms. And I think you should have that debate before we start worrying about how we handle if someone is recalled, because we can come back to that later and deal
So
with
is there a need at all to have a comment in the filing for office section regarding recall if recalls are covered later in the charter under Chapter 5?
Yeah, many cities who have recall provisions do have language with respect to making sure. And honestly, the way it usually happens is that nobody ever thought about it when they first adopted their charter, and so someone got recalled, and then they immediately ran for election again the next, and someone's like, they can't do that, they got recalled. And then you look at the charter and you go, yeah, no, they can do it because there's no prohibition. And that's usually how it happens. So then there's a charter amendment and they fix it, or fix it's not the right word, they change it. Fix it is all a matter of policy. So that's what I would do. I think that what we can do is we can kind of hold this open for any other qualifications that y'all think are appropriate and necessary. And then if there are no others, we can do one of two things. We can leave section 303 in and say, mayor and each council member shall have those qualifications as required by law, period, right? Or you could delete it entirely because state law handles it. All right.
Well, I think we'll just leave 303 and
So-
502 basically pending further discussion.
Yes, ma'am, and we'll make sure that we know to get back to those. Whew, okay.
So we've been at this for almost 2 hours. Charlie, what's your,
My limit is really 2 hours, but if you want to go 3, I'm okay with it, but I would take a quick break before we did go 3.
What is the commission? Are y'all ODing after the first time, or y'all ready to call it a day today?
Maybe we can do a couple more that it looks like we're gonna just say, let's go with it.
Yeah, I think we can do 3.04 very,
Yeah.
very quickly.
Yeah.
3.05 would take some time. 3.06 and 3.07 would take, 3.06 though, it wouldn't take any time, that's a boilerplate. But 3.07 would probably take a little bit of time. So,
So
yeah.
let's do one more then. Is that okay, Nadine?
Yeah, that's fine. How does that fit with the rest of the commission? Okay, so we're gonna do 304?
So 304,
That looks pretty heady to me. I mean,
I made one change, and so let me read it to you as it would read, as with my change. The mayor shall preside at meetings of the city council and shall be recognized as the head of the city government. And I know that there's a concern about the ceremonial, so I'll circle that. Of the city government for all ceremonial purposes and by the governor for purposes of military law, but shall have no regular administrative duties, period. The mayor may participate in the discussion of all matters coming before city council, period. The mayor shall vote only in the case of a tie.
And the statement about and shall have no power to veto.
That's not necessary to be in there because you would
Okay.
have to affirmatively state that. That's another one of those where I'm like, y'all don't need that. Because you would affirmatively state power to veto as opposed to state that it's not
right
necessary.
now, as I understand it, the mayor does have the power to veto?
Under the, no, see, I don't, except it's not a veto. So I'm a lawyer, so words mean things. Technically, the power of the mayor right now is under a general law type A city is to require it to come back for another vote. The mayor does not, in a general law type A city, does not have veto power. I guess technically veto, right? And then maybe I guess veto, but they don't call it that in the statute, and then you can override the veto. But the way the process works is the mayor has a certain amount of time to file objections to legislation. That's been 4 days to file objections to legislation. And if, with the city secretary's office, and if those objections aren't filed within 4 days, then it becomes operational as a matter of law, regardless of whether or not the mayor signs it. Believe it or not, mayor's signature is not necessary to enact it. I hate to tell you this, Mayor, it's ceremonial. Because it becomes, once they adopt it after 4 days, it becomes effective as a matter of law unless there's, unless it needs to be published in the paper or something. And then, so if he or she files those objections within the appropriate standpoint, then it has to go back to city council for reconsideration, but it has, I don't remember, is it a vote of the entire council, I think? Yeah, so 3, it only takes 3, right? Sounds like you read, so it takes 4. So it would take 4 people to override, quote, the veto.
We had a discussion about this, and, I've been mayor, and I go, I had that right?
Yeah, a lot of mayors don't even know they have that.
Yeah, I mean, it's not been something that's been used in Garden Ridge, so.
Yeah, a lot of mayors don't even know that they have that authority in the statute. But the reason why you don't have to say there's no veto power is because unless you affirmatively give it to them, there's no need to affirmatively say they don't have it.
So Mayor, Nancy, how y'all feel about leaving it as only in case of a tie? How do you feel about the veto deal and all that? Leave it? Go?
So does the veto change in home rule versus type A general law?
Yeah, unless you've affirmatively placed the veto in the charter,
The
there is
mayor wouldn't have
none. There is none. So that's why I said it's not necessary to say and shall have no veto power because it doesn't transfer. If it's not in the charter, you don't have it. If you want to put it in there, we can.
And it's the same thing as the veto power is in general law.
Well, technically, you could give the mayor full power of veto with a more than supermajority requirement to overrule. I mean, this is the beauty of the charter. You can put it, it's your choice as to how your form of government works. So, nobody realizes that, right? So, yeah, I mean, if you'd like to take what they have in the general law with respect to that authority, we can slide it in here. If you don't want that for the mayor, then we just leave it silent. So, however you want to handle it.
So we had this discussion earlier today, and going back to something I said at the beginning of the meeting, my number one job as the person sitting in the office of the mayor is to protect the city of Garden Ridge. We are extremely fortunate to have such a wonderful city council put together right now, both the last election and one new council member, Kelly Smith, in this last election. We are fortunate to have that in the city of Garden Ridge. That does not exist everywhere else in the San Antonio area, I promise you. However, it's possible in the city of Garden Ridge with elected officials that we could have that at some point. So allowing the mayor, the veto, whatever we call it, possibility, I could see, I wouldn't use it now, but in the office of the mayor, that's a possibility to be able to use it to help protect the city. There could be something that comes down that just doesn't make sense. A city council passes it, and the mayor says, no, I gotta protect the city, and comes across with the veto, just like we do in our federal government. So it's there to protect the city. I can't think of a reason to use it now, based on who we have on the city council, so.
But I would assume the city council takes an oath, just like you do as a mayor, that their focus is to advance and benefit the city of Garden Ridge. And it's not one council member that makes a decision for our city, it's a vote of up to 5 people that makes a decision. So your veto power as an individual person is now riding against the opinion of 5 council members in their decision to vote. And I am assuming that they're taking the same oath to protect the city as you as the mayor are taking to protect the city. Am I wrong in that statement?
No, you're correct in that statement. However, you and I are altruistic in that sense, Jim, that you took an oath, you need to honor that oath. That's not always the case. So there's 5 city council members. All it would take is a vote of 3 to 2 to pass legislation, if you will, that the mayor, who's ever in that seat, could go, whoa, that's really not a good idea, but 3 council members said it was. The veto happens, and then it would require 4.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt because I didn't think that was accurate, so I pulled it up. No, it's what it says is, so if the mayor returns an ordinance or resolution to the governing body with a statement of objections before the 4th day after the date the ordinance or resolution is placed in the city secretary's office, the governing body shall on return reconsider the vote by which the ordinance or resolution is adopted, period. If a majority of the total number of members of the governing body, excluding the mayor, approve the ordinance or resolution on reconsideration and enters the vote in the journal of the governing body's proceedings, the ordinance or resolution takes effect. So it's just a majority. So it's just a 3. So it's not a supermajority, it's 3. So it doesn't change the requirement. That's why I always say it's really not a veto, because it's not a supermajority to override. He just forces them to take another vote, he or she.
So with what Charlie just said, then I'd be even more in favor of it, to go, whoa, let's reconsider this, let's talk about it one more time in the next meeting next month, to discuss it again, and maybe have some better arguments either way.
Yeah.
So I'd be more in favor of it.
So from my understanding, that veto, for whatever it is, only comes into play when there's a minor majority vote. If all 5 city council members voted on something, the mayor wouldn't have the ability to say no.
No, it could be voted on. It could be a unanimous vote, and if under the law, if the mayor disagrees with any vote, unanimous whatever it happens to be, the mayor can file objections within 4 days, and if that happens, then it has to come back to city council for, as the mayor stated, let's take another look at this, make sure we want to do it, and then just a simple majority, that's what it says. But if there's only 4 people there, it still takes, I mean, if there's only 3 people there, it still takes 3.
For him to do that, it has to be written into our charter?
Yes.
Okay.
Jim, I'll be honest with you, and the commission, just like Nadine said when we discussed this today, I'm like, the mayor does have the ability to veto. I didn't know that. It's never come up. Again, I can't think of a reason to do it other than what we just talked about. So if we have the ability to do it now, I think let's preserve that right to take another hard look at something and maybe have some different arguments come back the next month.
To play devil's advocate, I agree with your concept. What if it's the mayor that's the bad apple?
Sure.
And we now are subjecting to go through that. However, as I understand it, you will have the objection, it'll go back and they can come back with it. What happens if they approve it again? Does he have veto again? Or is it over after the
No,
first
well,
term?
the way it's written in the statute, it's very clear that they bring it back, and if it's adopted by a majority, it goes into effect. So it's one bite at the apple.
One time.
But it could happen on multiple items.
Yeah.
Any other questions for me?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your answer. I'm having trouble, I guess, because I can't read his lips. So what was your answer to over and over again?
The way this statute is written, you get one bite at the apple. Once it goes, the way the statute's written is once it's forced to go back to the city council, if they get a majority vote at the next meeting where it's reconsidered, then it goes into effect.
Sorry, I've been blocking that view all night. I apologize.
Some folks might find that appealing that you're blocking the view of me.
Probably not. Any other questions for me? Thanks, Nadine.
So, commission. This one's a toughie. The bottom line is that under general law type A, the mayor has this, we're gonna call, I don't know what to call it. I hate calling it veto.
Yeah, I don't like calling it a veto because there's
It's
not
not
an
veto.
override. Like,
Override.
File of
Override.
objection, right?
Call it
Yeah.
ceremonial.
Well played, Mayor.
He-
Well played.
He can file an objection. Yeah.
Under class, type A, he can file an objection. Do we want that to carry over into the home rule charter is the question.
Do you need a motion on that? Because I think we do. I think it's a tremendous balance of power that doesn't vest too much power in an individual. It just gives our mayor the ability to push back and have it relooked. And I think that's we have it now, and it's not adding power to our existing governmental structure.
So what would the wording then be, Charlie?
I would bring back, if you vote to do it, I would bring back some wording. I would essentially track the statutory language,
Yes.
but I would bring that back for consideration.
Any more discussion? Anybody want to?
Charlie, just I guess, would it be appropriate for the mayor to say, like, this subject, since we can't come to a conclusion or something like that, let's table it for an indefinite period of time? Is that?
The mayor could certainly make that recommendation and technically even make that motion if there's nothing that prohibits a mayor that doesn't vote from making a motion.
and that-
But
it's
it would
not a
still take a
veto.
body, that would not be a veto, but it would still take the governing body to vote on that. He couldn't, or she couldn't just unilaterally make that decision. Could make the recommendation, could actually make the motion, but there would still have to be a vote by the governing body to make the decision.
So in that paragraph, as I understand, we're allowing the mayor to vote only in case of a tie, and we would give him the ability to, whatever, file an objection to fill in the rest of the paragraph.
Yeah, so your motion.
Not using the word veto.
Right,
but-
yeah, no, sure, that's fine. Your motion would be to bring forward the mayor's authority as a general law city to postpone, to reconsider a vote, because that's what it is. It's a reconsideration of the vote
His
into the
ink is not
charter.
going to dry on the paper. His
Right.
ink is simply saying, go
Right.
back and relook
That's-
at it.
that's correct.
And re-vote on it.
That's correct.
So is that a motion?
It is, but I'm not sure how to word it.
I think it's good enough for what we're doing.
Okay, if that's good enough, what I said, he votes only in the case of a tie, and he retains the ability under current general law to file an objection against future,
And require reconsideration.
that's my motion, and I'm sticking to it.
I have a motion. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Motion and a second. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. With that, we go on to item number B, and I think there was some clarification that we need with our process. Marissa, why don't you describe what our process, this is technical stuff for pro tem. Can you describe what our current process is and what we'd probably like to have in here?
So currently what we've been doing is we've been doing the mayor pro tem election during the canvass of the election within the same meeting. We usually canvass the election first, and then we immediately jump into electing a mayor pro tem. If we were to leave the wording as stated in here, this would require us to wait until the meeting in June, when our official canvass always happens in May.
And
Something
I
to
guess
consider.
the thing that came to my mind is with Andrew going out so quickly that time, you could conceivably have a situation where someone was elected and then immediately, elected mayor and immediately get ill and not be able to serve, and we,
And I have no issues with the process, and I'm happy to draft whatever. There's just one, it's never happened, sounds like, but so that everybody knows, a quorum for a canvass is only 2. So technically, you could have only 2 people show up and vote for a mayor pro tem. It's never happened, sounds like. Sounds like there's very little risk of it happening, but I would be amiss if I didn't, because otherwise I'm the guy that's going to get blamed. But technically, at a canvass, if it is only a meeting to canvass the votes, a quorum is 2.
but we canvass the vote and then we have a full meeting.
So you do it at a regular meeting?
You're right.
So you do it at a special meeting, okay? So because then that would be, well, but still, it's a special meeting only to canvass the votes, or do you have any other agenda items?
We'll have other agenda items. Typically, it is appointment of the mayor pro tem, or election of the mayor pro tem, the oaths of office are given at that meeting,
Okay,
so we can fit that within the timeline.
okay. Well, we can draft something up that does that.
Typically, we assign or designate signatures on city bank accounts
Okay.
at that meeting.
Okay,
So
All
I guess
right.
it'd be fundamentally the first meeting after the canvass, and the first meeting after the canvass is on the same night as the canvass.
right. I just want to make sure we draft something that's, I don't have any problem. Do we have this codified somewhere, that this is how it's done, or that's just kind of how it's been done?
It's just how we've been doing it.
So, and that's fine, that's absolutely fine too, there's no problem with that.
There's also
But,
been
but we're gonna have to
times-
come up with some language to put in here if that's how you want to do it.
There's also been times that if the time frame to canvass is very close to our regular meeting, we will cancel the regular meeting and call a special meeting, but include the entire agenda of a regular meeting
Got
with
it.
the election.
Okay.
things. So we're not having two meetings basically in the same week because a lot of our council members
Sure,
work,
sure.
have other obligations.
Is it fair to, well, I guess if the mayor pro tem was voted out of office or didn't run, that could be problematic. I mean, it seems to me the first regular meeting after the canvass of the votes, is that a problem?
That would typically be not occur until June.
Till June, okay, all right, okay. Let me,
Can we just say
Can we
something
just
to the
ask-
effect of immediately
Yeah.
following the official canvass?
sure, we could do that. We could do that, absolutely. So the reason this is always an issue is because I'm not gonna tell you, well, you'll be able to figure it out. No, you won't. The last council meeting I was just at last night, it was a big fight over, believe it or not, appointment of the mayor. It wasn't a fight. There was underlying tension. How about that? With respect to the appointment of the mayor pro tem. And the timing of that, for some reason, which I've never been able to figure out, is always, an issue, and I haven't been able to figure it out. We can leave it, we could basically just say, city council shall appoint a mayor pro tem annually, and shall be appointed on or before the first regular meeting in June. And then just let city council figure out how and when they want to do it within that time frame. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Rather than getting so hyper-technical, which some cities like to do?
So the deal is Charlie will draft.
Yeah, I'll bring back some language that says essentially what I just said.
And with that, I think we've reached a great stopping point. So do I have a motion to adjourn? Well, excuse me, I messed up. Next, the item B, announced date time, next meeting, Monday, December 12th, 6 PM. So now do I have a motion to adjourn? Oh, citizens' comments. Any citizens here? No, there are no citizens. Now can we adjourn? Motion to adjourn.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Have a motion, do I have a second? Motion second, all those in favor say aye. Any opposed, motion carries, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.
Great job, everybody. I don't think I have to bring this whole thing anymore.